From the book, Trayvon and Jesus. Written by Kenyatta Johnson. Get the full book at blacklivessavannah.org. Prologue. Dear Lord, he began to pray. His words were audible only to his own mind. He recalled the prayer that his grandmother had taught him when he was a little boy. I shall not fear no man but God. Though I walk through the valley of death. If I should die before I wake. Please God walk with me, take me to heaven. He continued to repeat the prayer as his spirit was slowly severed from his body. The fear of the unknown began to insulate him. People usually say that your whole life flashed before your eyes at death. But not for Trayvon. The only thing he could think was the curiosity of what was next. He had been afraid before in his life. But the fear that was now engulfing him was becoming unbearable. Oh God! He cried out. In the anguish of his mind was when he saw the young girl. The fear had caused him to be oblivious to what was going on around him on the sidewalk. His killer was still there, but now there was also someone else. The girl walked towards him. It was Latasha Harlins. She was the beautiful 15-year-old girl that was killed by the Los Angeles Korean convenience store owner in 1991. Her death had made national headlines concerning racism and violence towards unarmed blacks. Trayvon, himself being a frequent victim of racial profiling, had once watched the story of her murder on the internet. Latasha appeared a few years older, but her youth and beauty remained. She wore a white full-flowing gown that draped over her shoulders and reached to the pavement. Her dress was whiter than anything he had seen. The glow from the appearance of the dress seemed to brighten the already well-lit street. Apart from the glow of her dress, it was the appearance of Latasha that captivated him. Her long braided ebony locks flowing down to her waist. Her beautiful brown skin was flawless. And her eyes were a piercing hazel that seemed to penetrate his soul. She was more than gorgeous. She was immaculate. He wanted to speak, but Latasha's beauty left him without words. Latasha remained silent, but her eyes communicated to Trayvon perfectly. She knelt down to him and looked at him, beckoning him. Follow me, her eyes spoke to him. It was then that Trayvon knew that he could leave his body. He allowed himself to succumb to the rising sensation that he had felt earlier. He pushed himself up and saw that he was ascending out of his body. He felt much lighter as he took his first steps post-mortem. He looked at his spirit and saw that the blood that had been flowing from his body had stopped. The broken bones and skin had been healed from his abdomen. The bruises on his head where his murderer had punched him were also gone. But to his surprise, he was still wearing his hoodie. He was confused. Latasha spoke without words. He could hear her in his mind again. Follow me. He stood to his feet and looked into Latasha's eyes. He was enamored. Latasha, knowing that Trayvon was fixating on her appearance, she began to turn around. She knew her beauty was only a reflection of a greater beauty and did not want Trayvon to worship her. She too was a victim. Crossroads. As Trayvon began to follow her, drawn almost involuntarily, he stopped as he saw the back of her head. The sight of Latasha had changed when she turned around. The back of her head, which from Trayvon's earlier view was filled with beautiful flowing locks, now was much different. The back of Latasha's head still had the wound from the gunshot that would take her life years ago. It was visible and seemed to have not yet healed. When a drop of blood fell from her wound onto her brilliant white gown, Trayvon's spirit became incapacitated. The realization of his own death began to set in, which caused him serious grief. It was as if now, that the feeling of her was reminding him of his own murder. He collapsed to his knees as he began to cry uncontrollably upon seeing the blood of the little girl. It was as if he was experiencing her death in his own spirit. Latasha turned back around. She walked to Trayvon and placed her hand on his back. It was the first touch he could remember feeling since the struggle with his killer commenced. Her touch lifted his spirit. She then took her hand and touched his chest. Trayvon, she spoke in a voice that was soft and sweet. Her voice resonated through his ears. Trayvon, she replied again. He looked up to the young girl, humbled by her beauty but gripped by the thought of death. Trayvon, she spoke again. He remembered when his mother told him about why she named him Trayvon. The name came from the name Travis, but his mother joked that she thought the name sounded too white. The name Travis meant crossroads. His mother told him that she always believed that Trayvon's life would be so impactful that it would serve as some type of crossroads or bridge for people. She had the belief that a mother's naming a child attached a special sense of divine destiny to the child. It was as if the memory of his mother was now speaking through Latasha. Just as you were named, Latasha spoke. Your life and death will be a crossroads for many people. Do you believe this? Assent. Yes, he replied. I believe. Latasha smiled. The little girl knelt down and took Trayvon in her arms. He could feel that her strength was greater than a full-grown man. She lifted him up and looked to the sky and began to pray. Lord, all souls are yours. The souls of the righteous and the souls of the wicked. I now bring the soul of Trayvon to you to be judged. Guide us safely into your presence. Blessed are you, Lord, the Lord of life, and the Lord of death. Latasha grasped Trayvon and held him tightly to her chest. Trayvon could see the appearance of the street and neighborhood beginning to decrease in size. He could hear a whistling sound coming from every direction as a powerful wind began to blow. The street shook violently as Latasha became engulfed in light. She was no longer recognizable as Latasha. She had morphed into something else. Her entire being was shrouded in a blinding prism of light so bright that he was forced to close his eyes. As soon as he did, he felt his spirit shoot upward at what seemed to be the speed of sound. He didn't have to see what was happening. He was leaving Earth behind to meet his Creator. And as the flood of thoughts, emotions, and feelings penetrated every part of his spirit, he only had one thought: God, why did you let me die? Darkness. The consciousness of death was a soft wind that was cold yet stirred the soul with wonder. The air from the ascension penetrated his spirit in such a way that the speed of light seemed to become a part of him. He still could not see anything around him but knew that he was still moving upward. Latasha held him tightly as they sped toward the heavens. He wanted to see what was around him but felt that he could not talk. Sensing that he wanted to see, Latasha removed her covering from his eyes. In a moment he saw a glimpse of his spirit in space traveling at light speed. He saw stars in the forms of light beams as if they were falling out of space. The speed with which he was traveling was so great that everything in the galaxies before him appeared to be dropping. He was in utter awe that he was in space, beholding universes in a split second of time. Latasha slowed the speed of their ascent. It was there that she stopped to allow him to see again. As his eyes opened, he saw right there in front of him was a supernova. It was far enough for him to view the dying star but seemed close enough for him to touch. The massive body of light was running out of fuel, pouring out energy from its core. The star vibrated with a pulsation as if it were waiting to explode. For the first time since death, after opening his eyes to see the celestial bodies, Trayvon thought, who is this that could make such power? He trembled in fear as he realized that he was going to meet this God. Latasha sensed his fear. She had been given the power to be a familiar and comforting face to him before he was judged. This power also gave her discernment to feel every emotional change in her departed spirit. She knew that fear was natural, especially upon beholding the galaxies. She recalled when she herself made her journey. It was almost 3 decades ago that she had been shot and killed. The first moments after she died, she attempted to get up and argue with her killer, thinking that she was still alive. It was only when she saw her body on the ground twitching that she realized that she had passed. The anxiety of death was too much for a 15-year-old girl who was just going to the store to get orange juice. Thankfully, her guide Addie Mae came to her aid. She decided to shroud his sight again. She understood that Trayvon was yet to face God. Which, depending on God's decision, would be the most fearful reality to face or the most joyful. Her covering of his eyes allowed him to find solace in his own memories and familiar self-thoughts. The ascent finally came to a stop. For the first time in his life had been speechless in word and thought. He had not spoken a word to Latasha and could barely speak a word to his own psyche. But he knew that this journey would eventually lead him face to face with his Creator. He had thought about a Tupac Shakur song titled, "Who Do You Believe In?" It was one of his dad's favorite songs. In the song, Tupac poses a list of all the questions that he had for God, things that he didn't understand, the death of Latasha being one of them. He could hear his thoughts repeating the lyrics. I see mothers in black crying, brothers in Pakistan. Plus everybody's high, too doped up to ask why. Watching our own downfall, witness the end. It's like we don't believe in God 'cause we livin' in sin. I asked my homie on the block why he's strapped, he laughed. Pointed his pistol as the cop car passed and blast. It's just another murder, nobody mourns no more. My teardrops getting bigger but can't figure what I'm crying for. Is it the miniature caskets, little babies? Victims of a stray, from drug dealers gone crazy. Maybe it's just the drugs, visions of how the block was. Crack came and it was strange how it rocked us. Perhaps the underlying fact they had explained genocide. It's when we write on our own kind. What is it we all fear? Reflections in the mirror. We can't escape fate, the end is getting nearer. He repeated the last line to himself. We can't escape fate, the end is getting nearer. The end had come for him, but he knew that his journey into death was just beginning. He thought about the dying star that his eyes had witnessed in the blink of an eye. The power of the massive body of light was symbolic of his own life. Like the star, he had been born into the darkness of poverty. His mother had been a teen mother for many years and had struggled greatly to take care of him. There were many nights of darkness, whether it came from the actual power being cut off or from just the reality of being a poor black kid. But despite that darkness, it was the relationships that he cherished with his mother and his father in later years that always provided him with hope that he was special. He was taught that no dusk came without the break of dawn. Yet despite being born in the darkness of poverty and oppression, by God's grace, he was able to shine bright in the world. Soon, his gift of communication, his love for the arts, and most importantly his vibrancy of life would shine forth in the world. He recalled the supernova again. Despite the brilliance of the star, from the moment of its creation, it began to die. Trayvon's life, as bright as it was only a dim candle destined to burn out. He wept. Valley. Trayvon could sense that the descent was coming to end. The speed by which Latasha was carrying him had greatly slowed down, and the sound of the speed by which they were traveling began to decrease. Latasha kept his eyes covered as she landed upon and within the astral plane. Commonly known as the shadow of death, the astral plane was the place that all human consciousness met the immaterial world at a precipice of the suspension of time and space. As Latasha prepared to open Trayvon's eyes, she communicated to him telekinetically. She knew she had to prepare him for what he was about to experience. Trayvon. I will open your eyes to see that which is unseen. I will open your ears to hear that which is unheard. Your spirit has passed from life to death to life again. Just as I have passed from death to life, so too must you. Your spirit must be translated into your eternal essence. Trayvon couldn't speak and didn't need to. He knew that Latasha could read his thoughts like a book. He replied in thought. What must I do next? Latasha responded. You must walk through the valley of the shadow of death alone. Trayvon thought to himself. He had heard so much about the valley. His grandmother had familiarized him with the famous passage of scripture Psalm 23, Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff comfort me. Trayvon had the hope that the same God of his grandmother that would allow him to overcome so many odds, survive so many tragedies, and send Latasha to carry him, would walk with him through death. When I open your eyes you will be required to take 6 steps upward, Latasha spoke. With each step, your spirit will be enlightened to a greater degree. She could sense that he was ready. She removed the covering from his eyes as she rested within the astral plane. What he saw was more brilliantly complex than any images of the universe he had seen in books, or more grandiose than the magnitude of the supernova that he had bypassed. He had arrived within what appeared to be a 4-dimensional tesseract. The height of the cube seemed infinite, though he could see that at the very top was a fluorescent wide door entrance that was at the top. Underneath the door were deep blue circular bows that traveled the entirety of the tesseract. The form of the bows was that of an upside-down rainbow. Each bow possessed what amounted to 1,000 oceans flowing incessantly within. The sound of the rushing waters seemed to coincide like a million tides coming in with the precision of an orchestral conductor. The number of bows was innumerable. Within each bow was a star. These stars were larger than that of the supernova that he had seen during the ascent. The number of stars was greater than 1,000,000 snowflakes, with each celestial body having its own unique shape, light, color, and rotation. Despite the light that proceeded from each star, the tesseract was not fully illuminated. There was a still and dim shade that enveloped the cube that made every facet of its dimensions all the more mysterious. Underneath the bows of waters and stars were deep and mountainous sand dunes that were continually shifting under the current of the water. They were the color of the earth, deep auburn, hazel, and green. The dunes had within them writing from an unknown language that appeared in large print on the outside of each landmass. The writing was that of hieroglyphics, but was greater in their microcosm of detail. The sand dunes had to stretch up 200 stories high and looked as if they could collapse at any moment under the weight of the bows that were above them. The constant movement of both the dunes and the scripts gave it the appearance of being alive. He then looked down. He could see his bare feet standing on soft cool grass. His spirit could feel the blades penetrate his toes and support him under the massive pressure of the valley. Despite the trembling that he could feel underneath him, he could see for miles around him that the ground upon which he was standing was secure. Trayvon looked back up to the door that he had first seen above him. Immediately from the door appeared massive steps falling out of the door above him. The falling steps sounding like a demolished building crumbling to the ground. But even greater than the sound of the steps were their size. They were gargantuan. Each step was illuminated by the light that flowed from the door above. It appeared as if the falling steps, although slow in their descent, would come down right on top of him. He wanted to run but was unable to. And even if he could run, there was no place to escape this massive animated walkway. Sensing his fear, Latasha spoke to him audibly. She knew that he needed to hear a human voice that would calm him. "Yea," she spoke. Despite the sweetness of her voice, for the first time its sound reverberated both over the oceans in the bow and the falling steps. He looked at Natasha as she continued to speak. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of death," she continued. She paused in